Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again. It is 3 o'clock Eastern Time on a Monday, which means it's time once again for Inside Analysis. That's right. My name is Eric Kavanaugh. I will be your host for today's show in which we talk about the information economy from the analytical perspective. We're going to talk about a very interesting concept that some gentlemen are working on, a handful of companies really, called DataOps. But before we get there, we're going to really try to frame the argument and help everybody understand what's going on and why it's important and what you need to know to understand it and to work with it. So let me just start off talking about the whole business that I've been in for the last 20-odd years or so, which is wonderful stuff. It's really something that started with data warehousing, then it moved into business intelligence, and then big data came along and really started to change the game a little bit. And along the way, analytics has really been the goal. Like companies are trying to figure out ways to understand their data, to understand things like pricing, to understand consumer behavior, to understand who's doing what and where and why and when and how and all that kind of fun stuff. And to do that, you have to have data. You have to use data to get a handle on all that kind of stuff. Well, the challenge, of course, is how do you organize all that data? Where do you put all that data? How do you get it all into a situation where you can actually do some meaningful analysis? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So it's a fascinating industry. There are so many challenges, though, and I think part of the real challenge is that the ground keeps changing or moving around underneath us. It's almost like there's a tectonic plate or two grumbling underneath the ground year after year. And in the last few years, that has really come to fruition to a serious level of disruption, and that is because of the cloud, for example, because of big data, because of things like the information space, the information world, all just converging. And then you think about social and mobile. You know, sometimes we talk about SMAC, social, mobile, analytics, and cloud, and these are fundamentally massive forces that are converging right now and really grinding out new realities for businesses as they try to figure out what to do. So the good news is there's a lot of opportunity these days to change what you're doing, to understand the market, and to do something new and interesting, and to do so with data underpinning your ideas. And the guys that we have on the show today, there are a couple innovators, entrepreneurs, who have put together a company called DataKitchen. We'll be talking to Christopher Berg and Gil Benghiat of DataKitchen. And I love this concept. I love the metaphor that they're using. And I guess I'll bring in Christopher first to talk about where this idea came from and what these guys are doing. So, Christopher Berg, welcome to Inside Analysis.
Hey, thank you very much. We're happy to be here.
Sure thing. So, you guys recognized an opportunity, really a huge problem in space, I guess is how I would describe it, in our business and the whole business of managing information assets. And you realize that there has to be a better way. So let's kind of talk about where the idea first came from, because you guys knew each other, I think, in a previous life where you were working collaboratively on some solutions. Can you talk about where you were working and when you had the realization that this was an opportunity for you to build a company around?
Yeah, well, Gil and I worked at a company that did analytics for the pharmaceutical industry, and we started working together about 2005. And it was at the time it was a small company, and it did really everything that you could do with analytics. We built databases, we integrated data, we did visualization, we did what's now called data science, which is the application of algorithms to data, all to try to kind of grow the company. And so if someone had a data problem, we would say yes. And you know, the space that we were in was really marketing and salespeople and executives, and they tend to actually be pretty demanding customers because they inherently don't. Some of them do, but they're not really analytic people. And so they just wanted things fast. They just wanted insights to make decisions, especially during in pharmaceutical products during product launches. There's a lot of questions that need to be asked, or in other cases, there's just a rapid series of questions that go on. And so both Gil and I worked for the guy who founded the company. He was a physician, went to Harvard Medical School here in Boston, and a really smart guy, but not a technologist. And he was very accurately representing what the customers want when he felt that we needed to do things really fast. And I'd gather up some engineers, some data scientists, some people who did consulting and data visualization. We built a software product, and we get a request from the customer, and we put them in a room and talk and say, okay, we're going to do X, and it will take 2 weeks. And we'd be very proud that it would take 2 weeks because we thought we were, pretty good. And I'd walk into my boss's office, and he'd look down his glasses at me and say, well, I thought that would take 2 hours. And I'd sort of go out with the tail between my legs, and I'd walk back to my office, and I'd pick up the phone and get a phone call from one of my customers, and they'd be yelling at me that there was something wrong in the data, there was an error, and if we didn't get it right, they'd kick us out, which as a consulting company was very worrisome. And then I'd walk out of my office, and one of our bright and bushy young engineers would say, hey, there's a great open source tool. Can I use X, this new tool, to do something? And so we live the life of how do you deliver insight data with fast, with high quality, and be able to innovate, use tools that you love. And so that really is where, Gil ran the engineering, I was the chief operating officer. We sort of lived the life of what we see our customers living now, and the people who are internal to a company who are trying to deliver insight. And you talked about the great information change and all the data has value. There's actually a bunch of people in the company who have titles of chief data officer, chief analytic officer, sometimes they're data scientists, sometimes they're data engineers, sometimes they're in IT, sometimes they're in their own department. And they're tasked in an organization to take that big flow of data that's coming in and turn it to a series of ideas that can influence the business behavior. And so from my perspective of those people, they're kind of like me. They're kind of nerds. They're a different sort of nerd, but they're sort of data nerds. And their job is to take all that data source and visualize it and tell stories about it and model it so that the company can make better decisions. And they are challenged in the same way I was challenged with my boss on how do you do things fast and how do you do things with high quality and how do you innovate and use all those great new tools out there. And so when we started the company, we just talked to a couple hundred people. We were very thorough, being nerds ourselves, trying to find the right business. And it occurred to us that we had lived the life of our customers, that we had this instinct of how to live and how to make things fast and how to help them. And so the genesis of the company is really sort of nerd solidarity, where we come more from the software nerd background, but there's data nerds out there and they're sort of suffering. And so we want to help them through this. And our idea is to do that with a software technology, because we're software guys, called DataOps.
Yeah, and you mentioned a lot of really good points there that I'd like to drill into. And I think everyone in the IT space, or even other spaces, quite frankly, has had this experience at some point. We made a joke when I was talking to you guys a few weeks ago about, wanting the chef to deliver some kind of slow roasted meat in 5 minutes with no prep time. And you're like, well, that doesn't happen. You have to prepare these things. And it's a question of managing expectations and really educating your customers, right? You want people to understand. And a lot of people don't really have the time or necessarily want to make the time to listen to a detailed point-by-point breakdown of how long it takes to do this process or that process. But to your point, it really pays when people do understand that, when they recognize, hey, if you're going to make some schema change in this database or in this data warehouse in the old-fashioned way, at least, that's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort, and there may be some problems along the way. So it's important that business people and consumers of these analytics solutions really understand that it takes a long time to do that stuff, right?
Well, yes and no. So I guess as a young manager, I would often resent my business partners who said, why does it take so long? Because it always was hard to explain, because sometimes things don't take long, they're fast, and sometimes they take really long, and it's hard to explain to someone who doesn't have an engineering mindset why some things are really fast and why some things are really slow, and why you can do some things quick, a one-off in Excel, but if you're going to do it in production, it takes a while. And that's a challenge that everyone who whether you're doing software or whether you're building a machine or whether you're delivering insight from data, that sort of technical mindset versus I need it now on the business side. And so I think they're really, the business people, I think in some ways are right, in that they need insight. They need to make decisions and need to be helped with the data, and they need to ask a lot of questions of the data and shake it up in different ways. And so I think the idea that we have, and that's not ours, is that you should really be able to make changes to a schema in a database and not take months to do it. and that you should be able to make those changes quickly and get them into production quickly, and do it in a way where you actually maintain quality and you don't kill yourself, and and you prove that it works beforehand. And so we talk jokingly about our being the guys who are against heroism and the guys who are against hope. And
I love
so
that.
That's sort of because if you think about it, there's always I have a wife who's an English teacher, right? And I live this life of how does an engineer communicate to an English teacher? And so technical things people glaze their eyes over. And so how do you say, oh, it's going to be really expensive? And I think business people just want the insight. And I think the industry needs to change to be able to allow the technology underpinnings to make big or small changes quickly. And I think the idea of DataOps is part of that transformation.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think that what you guys identified was a missing ingredient to the point of our show here in kind of bringing these worlds together, the business world, the IT world. And I see it really as bolstering and kind of completing the vision of what's called DevOps. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, and most people wouldn't be, it's talking about development operations. And it's where you've got actual software developers working directly with operations teams to solve problems, whether it be for fulfillment, for example, or any process that the business needs to do in order to get something done. A lot of times it has to do with web front ends, with taking orders and processing orders and delivering orders and all that kind of fun stuff. But it has resulted in some tremendous innovation in terms of streamlining business processes and being able to enable the organization to become much more agile. And I think that's all good stuff. But I think kind of lost in the shuffle maybe was the data component and just the lineage to understand where we got and how we got there and so forth. And to me, the whole data ops vision that you guys have put forward kind of completes the promise of DevOps and makes it more robust and more sound. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it does, Eric. Hi, this is Gil. And just to expand on that, if we look at the trajectory the software world took, if you turn the clock back 20 years or so, delivering every year was the norm. Delivering every 3 months was pretty good. Then this idea of Agile came in, and the idea was to deliver every week, which was impossible when the idea first came out. But now people are not only delivering every week, they're able to deliver actually several times a second. So the choice of being slow and solid or fast and fragile, you don't have to pick between the two. You could be fast and solid, and DevOps is the technical environment that let you do that. And what we've seen in the data world is that the technical environment to support that kind of development velocity has lagged, and something that we call DataOps is helping to achieve those goals.
Yeah, I really like this because if you think about how much faster the world is moving, just from a business perspective, it really is pretty mind-blowing. I mean, if you think about how, just in and of itself, the cloud and the maturation of the cloud has fundamentally changed certain aspects of business, it's just amazing. And we talked about this before the show, and just to give some context for our listeners out there, think about how disruptive Amazon has been to the retail industry, because now you can just go online and buy that part. You used to have to drive to the store, especially for a specialty part. If you think about, like, I'm in the radio business, so I have various elements of gear that I need. You can't find that at the Circle K or even at the Walmart. You have to go to a certain store that's probably on the other side of town, or at least you used to. Now you just hop online. So there are so many ways you can save money, but that is forcing businesses to change, all the different retails, et cetera. And then if you look at the epicenter of where these innovations are coming from, well, they're companies like Amazon and Facebook and LinkedIn. And these organizations have tremendous amounts of data, tremendous amounts of analytic prowess, and they're able to use that data to do some analysis to figure out how much do we charge for this service, how much do we charge for that service. You just look at what Amazon Web Services has done to the enterprise software market. In many ways, it's an enabler, but it's also a threat. And I see you guys really as filling in this really important role of tethering DevOps ideas and agility with the data that is the underpinning of all that stuff. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, yes, it does. And it's kind of funny you mentioned Amazon, because it's true they have lots of data. It's true Amazon Web Services really do help fuel DevOps and DataOps. But there's kind of a funny story where one of our customers, who's a director of analytics, said, Gil, I compete with Amazon. And I said, that's kind of strange. Is he selling stuff from his garage? So I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, with Prime and other options, my boss and my customers, they want something and they get it the next day. So they are expecting, that has reset expectations in analytics. So if people ask a question, they expect an answer the next day. So not only is the technology that Amazon provides disrupting things, just the speed at which they do business is creating something new, Amazon speed.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and it kind of speaks again to how the consumer technology space has disrupted workflow and expectations. It used to be okay to run a query, for example, and you're doing some analysis and wait 5 minutes or even an hour for that analysis to come back, for the query to come back. Now, that's a different world, because people have become spoiled by the immediacy of the web, by the immediacy of all these tools out there, and they think, well, if I can get this in my personal life, why can't I get it in the business life? And the answer to that question is probably like 45 minutes of different details that you could throw at someone. And I think a big part of the challenge is that in the workplace, you often have all these legacy systems for whether it's your CRM, your inventory systems, whatever you've been using to run the business. It's there and it's running. And we've talked on various shows on many occasions about how hard it is to retire any functioning system in a business, because especially if a business gets big, you don't really know. It's hard to know how many different applications, how many different touch points are going to be affected by pulling out some application and porting it to the cloud, for example. So I think the heterogeneity of the business world, just from a data and systems perspective, is the biggest reason why getting that level of agility is hard, right?
Yeah, because it's heterogeneous in a whole bunch of different ways, right? So, there's a bunch of systems, and each of those produce some data that you may want to analyze. And then there's new open data and data that you could purchase or use that you could also influence how you want to market or how you want to sell or how you change your internal dynamics. And then there's a whole variety of people who do different roles in understanding data, and there's sort of types of nerds. There are some people who carry Macintoshes and are really good at and have turtlenecks and are really good at visualization. There are some people who carry sort of the lunch pails of the data world, and they're called the data engineers. They're really good at moving data from A to B. And then there's sort of the mad scientists of the data world, the data scientists. And then there's managers and people who are architects and people who do quality. And these teams of people all have to work together. And then you also lay into that the different variety of tools that people may like. So that person who is the Macintosh carrying person may like a visualization tool named Tableau, or they may like their own. They may like to create their own. Some people like SQL, some people like ETL tools, some people like Python, some people like R. And companies have standardized on their own tools. And so there's this mix of lots of different data sets, internal and external, lots of different people who have different roles and different things they're good at, and then lots of different tools. And that's really the environment that most people find themselves in. And given all that mix, they've also want to be successful. And there's two aspects to that success. One, yes, is answering questions and giving original insight very rapidly and helping support the Amazon. But also it's a factory, and you need to produce quality analytics where the data is right and people can trust it. And so it's a really interesting business that all these people are in. One is they kind of operate a factory floor where all those source systems come in and transforms happen and artifacts are created and models are run and visualizations are done and they go out the other side. On the other hand, they also are kind of an art firm or an advertising firm where they're only as good as their next analysis. And so it's a really interesting relationship that these people, their tools, their data, and their customers have. And that makes it tough for them.
Yeah, and I like that you guys refer to lean manufacturing. You just kind of alluded to it right there, and how in a successful organization, especially, let's face it, a large organization, or at least a company that relies very heavily on information assets, you need to take that kind of manufacturing perspective because you need to appreciate that any mistake along the way is going to cause a significant error. You can just imagine, just the other day we bought some Lipton soup, and I got home and I opened up one of the boxes and it was empty. There's just nothing in there. Right? Well, that was a mistake on the manufacturing floor. When they actually packaged that stuff, the little guy just didn't get the product into the box, and there you go. But that's very rare. That's the first time in, I can't remember how long, that I went to the store and bought some product and got home and the box was empty. That almost never happens, because in the manufacturing world and the consumer packaged goods world, they take that very seriously. And what you're referring to is taking that mindset and that discipline and that focus and applying it to the information world, which I think a lot of people presume was already happening. But in many cases, it really wasn't, not because people made mistakes necessarily, but just because it's a pretty big nut to crack. And to do it effectively, you really need to think out all the different component parts, and you have to monitor all that stuff. So I think that what you've done is very clever by using this metaphor to help people understand, if you want to get the data right, if you want to get analysis of data that's accurate, you really need to take that lean manufacturing approach, right?
That's right. Because in data work, it's not a question of will something go wrong. It's just a question of when will something go wrong. So you want to be ready for it. And we took this idea from the software development discipline, which is our background. That when so how can you go from releasing every 3 months to every week to every day when your whole QA cycle takes 2 months? And the answer is automation. You automate your tests. So analogously, going from DevOps to DataOps, we have the concept of data tests, where it monitors and assesses quality as it flows through that pipeline from data to value. And it also, since it's data, we can make measurements like it's almost like you're getting ball bearings. You want to make sure they're arriving and that they're all within tolerance. So so you're exactly right, Eric. Putting in statistical process controls, monitoring data quality is important to making sure the numbers come out at the end. Because if we think about what happens after the data is assembled, somebody is getting insight from it, whether it's the analyst or the data scientist, and then someone's making a business decision, and they shouldn't have to second guess if the data is correct.
Yeah, and Gil and I are sort of in our early 50s, right? And I grew up in Milwaukee, and in Milwaukee, when I was 17, 18, I was starting to work my way through college, and I had to look for a job. And Milwaukee just got beat by the Japanese. There was just, at that time, people were afraid that the Japanese were going to take over the world, and a lot of manufacturing in Milwaukee went overseas, and auto manufacturing. And I remember reading in college or after college a book called The Machine That Changed the World. And how did the Japanese take over or beat the American auto manufacturers? And there was this guy called Deming, and looked at the industrial process, the operations of taking raw materials in and putting out a car, and started to say you should think about it in a different way. And it's process, it's focus. The problems usually don't come from the people on the assembly line. They usually come from the manager who's running the assembly line. They usually come from the process that the people are in. It's not the people's fault. He talks about following the red bead where something broke, and if you've got a package that had that package of soup that didn't have something in, there's a whole series of steps that went along in there to make that happen. And so how do you think about a process as an ever-improving system? How do you get to what the Japanese call Kaizen, continuous improvement? How do you have just-in-time manufacturing? All those things that happened in our auto world to make better cars, because obviously cars are better than they were in in 1981 when I graduated from high school. How did that all happen? And so that idea of operations and improving operational manufacturing by focusing on quality, that's really has changed a lot of the way people work who actually build things. And so that idea came into the software world and Agile and trying to, in DevOps, how do you actually, some people call it lean development, the lean startup. There's a bunch of terms that people have borrowed from that idea of looking at it as an operational process that you can improve, and the problems that go on in the process are usually the manager's fault that need to be improved. And we're just doing the same thing with data and operations. We're saying, you got to focus on the operational process of producing data and insight. You've got to metric it, you've got to measure it, and when you have problems, it's usually the manager's fault. It's not the person.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm glad you brought in this other example of the car manufacturing business. Think about how automated that whole industry has become. For those who haven't seen it, I would suggest getting on YouTube or going on Google and just look up some video so you can watch how cars are made today. I think there's a great video about Kias where it's all machines. It's all robots that are trained, designed, specifically programmed to do specific things. And, there is this ongoing conversation in our culture these days, our robot's going to take our jobs, is automation going to take our jobs? Well, I mean, my simple statement there is no. It's going to change jobs for sure. You do different things. Maybe you are just responsible for monitoring these robots, but that's a pretty important job. And I think we're going to see that in the data world as well, where as the smart companies automate many of these processes, like you talked about with testing, et cetera, that allows you to get to the good stuff, which is the analysis. Because you hear about this, I've heard it as long as I've been in this business for almost 20 years now, that there's so much time that goes into the prep, into finding the data that you want, aggregating it, putting it into a data warehouse, whatever the case may be. There's all this effort that goes into the prep when the nut at the end of that, or the carrot at the end of the stick, is the analysis, is trying to figure out what to do. And what we're doing now, especially with you guys, is you're fine-tuning that automation process to maximize the analysis time and value and not essentially lose so much time just doing the mundane stuff, right?
That's right. And it's kind of interesting that, your quality goes up by automating, your quality goes up by monitoring and assessing quality. But once you enable that, it actually, ironically, generates more work. Because once you can satisfy the data analyst and the business side and deliver some data and they come up with some questions, inevitably they come up with more questions. And that requires more data and more business rules. And it creates this virtual cycle of adding data generates more business questions, which is more data. And that's actually a work generator.
That's funny. Yeah, it's a virtuous circle, though, right? I mean, the neat thing is that by getting additional work, you are now fulfilling deeper business requirements that are probably hitting closer to home in terms of what the business needs, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's often a journey of discovery, because if you at the beginning ask your business customers, what exactly do you want to know? They're not quite sure. In fact, they don't always know it until they see it, or they need to see something to help figure out what the next step is. So by being able to deliver things in small increments and iterate and work collaboratively, that kickstarts that virtuous cycle.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I see we've seen this in our own lives, in our own business lives. Certainly, when you go into a meeting, if you're the data guy, one of the best tips that I ever heard was from a guy who does a lot of work with Dataversity, John Ladley. He once said to me in a podcast we were doing a number of years ago, actually, he said, if you have a meeting with a business team and this is the first meeting, he said the worst thing you can do is to walk in there with a blank sheet of paper and just start asking questions. He said what you really want to do is think through, okay, if I was this organization, if I were this team, what would my concerns be? What are some ideas? And he said you should go in there with sort of a pro forma suggestion. And here's where it gets interesting, right? He said the best case scenario, as you're making this pitch, is if someone gets all upset and goes, "Oh, no, that's all wrong." I was like, "Really? That's the best case scenario?" He goes, "Yes, because now that person is fully engaged." Right? And I thought that was so interesting,
Right.
meaning once you get them engaged, now they're involved in the process. And until they're engaged, they're not involved in the process. You could sail through a meeting and think it's fine, but then 6 weeks later in the old world, when you had this long sort of waterfall process, you'd get a real nasty curveball when someone said, no, that's not what I want. Go back to the drawing board. And you just wasted 6 weeks and all this time and effort, et cetera. So I thought that was very interesting that he reminded me, or basically gave me new information, that getting someone engaged in a negative way can be a very good thing because it means they're engaged. And I'm guessing you'd agree with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge in analytics beyond the operation side that we focus on. How do you get non-technical business people, non-analytic business people to trust that your insights can drive the organization? Because if you look at how a lot of people in the world make business decisions, it's by experience, seat of their pants, intuition, social proof, reading in the magazine, what's the coolest thing to do, and actually really being a data-driven organization. And you can't walk through an airport nowadays and not see some version of a sign saying, we're the consulting company who's going to help you be data-driven or analysts or insights. But at the end of the day, if you're running a business and some person who's your junior gives you a bunch of charts, you're going to doubt them. You're going to trust your instinct, and that transformation is ongoing to actually operate a business based on data as opposed to instinct. And managers, some managers are better, some aren't, and companies who are, if you look at it from a broad spectrum, companies who are more data driven are actually delivering higher valuations and higher growth.
Yeah, no, that's right. And you bring up a really good point here that I think we should dive into a bit, and I'll throw in another facet. And the point you just brought up is trust, right? I don't think people realize how important trust is until it's broken, frankly, and then usually it's very hard to mend. But trust is just a critical component of communication and of doing business. And really, it's amazing how much we just do trust people in our everyday lives. And you're really not supposed to trust too much, but we just do. And that's a good thing, I think, mostly. But trust is also important in communication, because if you don't have trust, then you're always questioning other people and you're always questioning motives, and that's not productive, right? If you're questioning the motives of some business partner, you're probably working with the wrong person, or you have a bad attitude, I guess is one way to put it. And I think
and it's also, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, it's also that there's trust, and there's just different languages that people speak. And so if you're a senior manager in a pharma company or in an automotive company, and someone comes in who's 10 or 15 years younger with you with a bunch of charts and graphs and says the data says this, and it goes against your intuition, your first instinct actually is not to trust that person. And I mean, I've done it actually. I've had people who are younger than me present me information. I go, "Oh, you're wrong." And so it takes a while for trust to build between the analytic team and the people who make decisions in an organization. And that trust has to happen through an iterative process, right? Through about giving some ideas, iterating on them, improving on them, changing them, and making sure that you don't make mistakes, obvious mistakes in the data gathering and data preparation phase. And so it really does, between an analytic team and the people who are the recipients of that analytics, having a good relationship where they can work with each other and trust is, I think, as you said, it's very valuable, and it also can be squandered.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And you talk about communication and the importance of sharing ideas. I think the really cool thing about the maturation of this information management space, and like I say, I think you guys are really onto something with the whole data ops concept, to formalize and streamline and really make that pipeline as bulletproof as possible. The cool thing is that when you do have trust, and when you're using information as the grounding for your conversations, that's when you can actually get a lot of stuff done, right? I think the older I get, the more I appreciate the value of every hour and every day, because you realize there are only 5 work days in the week, and there are only 2 days in the weekend, And it's interesting. I remember when I first became self-employed, which is a long time ago, I noticed that the week inverted psychologically, meaning when you're working 9 to 5 on someone else's dime, Friday at 5 p.m. is a great time. When you're self-employed, Friday comes around, you're like, oh no, it's Friday already? Did I get enough done? Did I bill enough? Like the whole thing turns inside out, right? But when you can rely on data as the foundation for your conversations, now you're all in the same ballpark, man. You're all at least revolving around some manifestation or some representation of the truth. And to me, that's a huge positive.
It is, yeah. And being a data-driven organization has its trust and truth, and because data is, it's not always true, but it gives you a good representation of reality that you can use to inform your decisions. In a lot of ways, once you start using data, it lines the intuition that you have about how your business is running and how you're doing it. And people, what we notice is you get this cycle of get some data, people start using it, they start seeing in this line chart, in this bar chart, in this KPI, in this metric, in the output of this model, they eat it up and they start understanding their business through that metric. And then, you know what? They're on to what the next thing is. And so the more metrics, the more models, the more visualizations you have in production that people are using day in and day out, you as an analytic team need to keep kind of that creative process going. And a lot of times, you may produce that next great metric, but sometimes you're reaching a dead end. And it is a very sort of creative process that teams go through to deliver insight. And that sort of that trust and that truth is really what makes the teams, I think, between their business partners and the analytic team work great together.
Yeah, and Eric, I also think that trust is something that's earned, but also there's trust, but there's also not perfection in this process. That even if you do use data ops, sometimes something will get through and will show up that's wrong. And I think it's important for companies and businesses to have the right culture where if there is a problem, it's acknowledged and you get to the root cause and say, okay, this happened. What can we do to our process? How could we make an improvement? What data assessment can we add so this doesn't happen anymore? And then automate it so you have the confidence it won't so it won't occur again.
Mm-hmm. And I really like what you mentioned there a second ago about lining your intuition, right? And also what you just mentioned right there a second ago about imperfection. And we have to realize that a couple things. One, perfect is the enemy of good. I always love that one. Right?
Yeah.
You want it to be good enough, and you want it to be getting better, I think is the key. And I love this concept of lining your intuition because intuition is extremely valuable. It's interesting. I was a philosophy major back in college, and I remember reading, I love this name, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Was written by Wittgenstein, right? He's such a smart aleck of the academic world because here what he did in this book is he outlined mathematically what can be said, which is an interesting proposition. And it's a mind-numbing book. I mean, for those who have not read it, if you want to just blow your mind, just pick up this book and try. It starts off, the world is all that is the case. That's the first line. And then he just kind of goes deeper and deeper from there. But the funny thing is he proves mathematically what can be said, and at the very end of the book, he basically says, yeah, that's all bollocks. That's all nonsense. I just told you. Right. And he says, that of which we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence, right? And the reason I'm making this point is that here we're in this business where we're all about the data, and the data is the most important thing, but the data is never going to be the answer itself. The data is always going to help you find the answer, but you, the thinker, have to be the one to do that. And so even though I see this whole industry in our business gearing around the importance of data science, and it's so refined now that we're calling it a science, and we're really going to understand what's happening, we're really going to know everything. But the truth is, at the end of the day, there is this sort of Zen reality where it's the gut instinct that is going to be right or wrong. And typically, intuition is not wrong because it's intuition. You've intuited that something is true, but you need the backup. You need the evidence to support what your belief is, and that's what the whole information management space can provide. So I think I guess what I'm speaking to is this misconception that the data has the answer. You will have the answer when you have the data that you need and have worked through the thought process to find the answer. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you wander a bit in trying to get insight. You know, maybe if you're not like a philosopher like Wittgenstein, but at least you're just a guy trying to figure out whether he should invest or not invest in his business. And it's a series of questions and answers that you go back and forth with your data analytics team on. And enabling the cycle time to do that quickly, instead of ask a question, come back a month later, then ask a question, come back another month later. If you can compress that time, you can help that business person improve their intuition and help them make better decisions. And that is really the key thing that we're trying to focus on, is the cycle time at which you can go from somebody asking, does this make sense? What is the data? Can the data tell me something about my business? To getting an idea in front of them in a one-off way, to putting that metric or chart or model into production for 1,000 people to use. That's really what DataOps is about. It's about that cycle time. And the benefit of it, I think, is by improving that cycle time, you just get to ask a lot more questions. You get your business people more engaged in the process. Their intuition gets aligned. They get to understand more of what's going on. And it's a process. It's sort of a wandering process where a lot of times the data doesn't tell you. You know, you can't. That which we know you can't speak of, right? The Wittgenstein phrase. Well, a lot of times data doesn't tell you. You know, it's incorrect, or it just doesn't have enough power to make a prediction. And so knowing what data can tell you and what can't tell you is also just part of the process.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really, really good point. And I like that you're bringing up the whole issue of cycle time, because that, I think, really is key just for human nature, meaning if you don't have a cycle time that is rapid enough to keep a human mind and a human spirit, if you will, of some person engaged, that rhythm, that cadence is really important. And if you break that rhythm, especially if you truncate it and it just remains broken for some extended period of time, it's gone. Like you don't have that rhythm again. This is why you have expressions like hitting on all cylinders, right? When your organization is hitting on all cylinders, you know that the timing is right, the processes are right, it has the right amount of fuel, everything is going the way it should. And I think that's where we're getting now in any kind of information-driven business, thanks to this combination of DevOps and DataOps, because now you're able to tune the machine as it's running, and you're able to identify the opportunities that need to be either adjusted or capitalized on, or whatever the case may be. And that's just a process. Like to your point earlier, it results in more work, but that's a good thing because it's productive work, right?
That's right. That is a good thing, and it's interesting when you take a step back and look at the whole analytic process. You know what we were just talking about. You know, asking ideas, planning tuition, getting answers. Some of them are dead end. That's kind of at the front, kind of asking questions, seeing what's useful. Then there's this promotion to when those useful questions, they become the standard reports that everybody gets in their mailbox every day or every Monday to drive things. And then there's like another level where those standard metrics become further operationalized and baked into software. And not every idea or every answer gets to follow that whole trajectory from an ad hoc question to being in a report to being baked into the software or operations of a company. But there is this kind of, it's almost a Darwinian process where the good ideas and the good questions get to travel down that way.
Yeah, and if you can improve how you do that cycle of moving things from far up questions to being used by everyone in the organization, that actually has real business value. And a lot of things are moving faster in the world, right? It's the cycle time that auto manufacturers deliver cars. It's the cycle time that software developers deliver new code into production. And I think analytics needs to focus on that cycle time of how much insight you can deliver and how fast you can do it in a period of time. And yeah, it's disconcerting that the world's moving faster, but in some ways, if we're moving towards a more truer, more valid world, that cycle time is actually a better thing.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really good point about that sort of hierarchy or life cycle, I guess you could call it, of reports, because you will find, of course, these KPIs. What gets measured gets managed. We all know that. So you will find that over time there are some reports that you want to be looking at every day. What are sales like? What are expenses like? What's the disparity between those two things? But as you get deeper and deeper into understanding your business, especially as the market changes, and I think that's everywhere these days, you really do need to get a finer grained view of what's happening and then be able to explain why. You need to know which products are selling well, which products aren't selling well. You need to know, which salespeople are doing well. And I think, to your point, not everything should get baked into actual software automating something, but a lot of stuff should, and the valuable stuff should. But nonetheless, you always want to keep your eye on the main ball, those main metrics, and be sort of wandering around to understand where the other optimizations can be found, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you want to be able to continue to innovate. And so, but you also have to realize that there are all these people with all these tools and all these data, and you don't want them to get burnt out or frustrated or overloaded. And so, what teams face is they kind of live in a superhero type world now, right? Where you go to data science conferences, and yes, I'm going to be a data scientist, and I can know my algorithms, I can do the data, I can talk business, and I can code, and I can do everything.
But you can't go on vacation.
Yeah, you can't. And so people build themselves into a heroic corner where they're trying to do this, improve the cycle time just by doing everything themselves. And it's first of all, there are few people who can do that because that talent's not evenly distributed, and those people actually tend to get bored quicker. And when they're faced with trying to do things over and over again, they tend to quit and leave because they can get there's a shortage of them, and they can job hop. So when you run a team of different people like this, you need to improve your cycle time, but you also need to not kill those people and make sure that they don't get stuck beholden on something that they created 6 months ago that no one else can touch and no one else can change. Because also that manufacturing process of like the searching for bottlenecks, that one person who knows everything in the manufacturing process, and if you change anything, you got to talk to him or her. That's the same thing in software, same thing in analytics. You got to look for the person who's the bottleneck, and often the person who's the bottleneck is just trying to be heroic and out of the right motivation, but not again, you get, if you've been a hero a few times in your career, you realize that yes, it's kind of good, but you're really putting a long-term set of technical debt on your organization that isn't to the benefit of everyone. And so we like to say part of data ops is don't be a hero, or more specifically, since we're analytics, don't be a hero 95% of the time. There's 5% of the time it's probably good to be a hero.
Yeah, this is a fantastic metaphor that you guys have come up with of the hero's journey, and I think you're exactly right. Deep inside, who doesn't want to be a hero? Everybody wants to be a hero, but you have to be careful because then you're expected to be the hero all the time, and you just have to be practical about how to understand what you did to be the hero and then get reasonable about how that can be then folded into some new process to prepare for tomorrow, such that you're not in that situation. Because you're right. I mean, the hero winds up being a sort of de facto bottleneck in a way, just in terms of how he or she fits into a certain situation, a certain scenario. But the question, of course, then becomes, all right, well, how did we get to this place? Why did we need a hero to step in? And that requires just discipline and thought and open-mindedness and managers who will listen and all that kind of fun stuff. That's just good organizational dynamics, right?
It is, but it's also, at the end of the day, it's the manager's problem, right? It's your leader. If you've got a hero and they've ended up creating a bunch of bottlenecks, it's your fault as a manager. And so that's really the hard part of blame your boss. You can't blame the technology. It is, and I say that from having been in that situation and having both been a hero myself in situations and managed people who've done it. And yeah, you end up 5% of the time is probably good. You need to make your customers happy, but you should also figure out a way that you can do things that meet the cycle time of business, but also not put people in a situation where they end up being heroic, because like software, like analytics, it's kind of complexity is the problem. People build models, write code, do visualizations, all that stuff. It's really complicated, and you get this big hairball of complexity. And yeah, sometimes there are certain people who are heroic, can get that big hairball in their head, and you can only call them, and they can do it. But as a manager, you want to make sure that you can pull that hairball apart and replace people in the process. And so that's really what also DataOps is also a sort of transformation in how you manage your team and how you work with the people in that team.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, we got about 9 minutes left on our radio show, and then for those of you out there in the listening world, if you want to learn more about DataKitchen and what they're doing, we'll be doing a webcast for a closer look right after the show. Just hop online to insideanalysis.com, scroll down to that webcast section that's kind of in the middle, or just click on the link for this show. Don't forget the data, why DevOps isn't enough, and on that page I've posted a link to the webcast. But in our last 8 minutes or so, guys, let's talk about who in the organization, who in a big company or a mid-sized company should be the person listening to this and who should investigate, right? Who is it? Is it a senior manager? Is it an IT person? Is it, what's the typical role of person who realizes, hey, these guys have what I need?
Well, I think it depends where you are on your own analytic journey. So I was out with a friend of mine last week. He's a chief marketing officer, and they just started to have a database of all their customer interactions. And he's like, well, how do I get value out of it? And he doesn't have anyone who does analytics for him. And so I think where you are, if you're starting off in your journey and just starting to get into it, I think hiring a person who can do a bunch of stuff one-off and maybe having them to go through their being a bit of a hero, I think it's all right. But if you're a manager who has 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, has things in production, has 10 or hundreds of people depending upon your insight, then you're in the data production business, right? You've got a manufacturing line of data, and then you're also in the insight production business. And how you do balance those 2 competing needs to innovate and give insight to your business partner in an ever-going river of questions, and then how you turn those things into safe, testable quality production deliverables, and how you not kill your team in the process or yourself, then that's where you need to start thinking about on DataOps. And so it's a very similar case to software engineers. You start off with 1 or 2 software engineers, and they don't start thinking about Agile and DevOps. They're just going. But once you get the complexity, once that sort of hairball of complexity gets a certain size, you should really, really start thinking about it, or else you're just going to be in a situation where you've already made a choice, and you're just going to be slow, and your cycle times are going to be long, and your business customers aren't going to be happy.
Yeah, it's a question. Like, I'm always looking at these different metaphors, and if you look at the agricultural world, for example, it was quite some time ago that became industrialized, and it got to the point where small farmers just could not compete because these very large farms using these incredibly sophisticated pieces of machinery were able to get so much more done and so much more efficiently than the small guys. And so we're seeing the same thing now take place in the world of data management, where the companies that have really thought through their processes and how data fuels those processes and how data can enable and streamline and optimize those processes, they're the ones that are really reaping the benefits. Whereas to your point, if you're still doing things manually, and who doesn't? I mean, and almost any mid-sized organization out there has a developer somewhere doing something. But if those procedures that the developers are following are not aligned with where things are going in the industry, you're going to fall behind. And I often think about the metaphor of a marathon. If you fall behind someone far enough in a marathon, man, it's really hard to catch up. So you have to kind of stay at least in the pack in order to not be lapped in order to not be kind of relegated to the past. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the agricultural metaphor is interesting where you're right, the big players, like Facebook and Amazon and Google, they have large teams of people working on this, and they're way ahead. However, Amazon or any of the any of the cloud technologies, they give the kind of the little guy tools in order to be able to spin up a data ops environment. You can turn on your own machine to do the transformation. You could turn on a database, and when you're done, you could turn it off. So they've enabled you to instantly get resources at a very reasonable price. So I think that if you're a small shop, you could the people that are doing it can be so like a manager or a manager type role can lead that effort and that change. But if you're a big shop, it is a transformation, and it's not just the technology; it's also how they're organized. Because we've seen where there's many departments and a lot of specialization, and you want to bring those people together and have them work collaboratively. So you need someone in the organization that can really change the organizational structure. So I think a small team can have someone lower in the organization do it, but in a large company that is not quite working the way Amazon or Google or Facebook is, need someone higher up who could really do a reorg.
Mm-hmm. And that is sometimes what you need, right? I mean, there comes a certain time in the evolution of any business model where you have to realize you are no longer in sync with the marketplace and you need to shake things up. It happens all the time. You have to be careful about what you do, and I think the key is you want to let the data drive that decision. And that reminded me of one last point I want to dive into before our radio show concludes today. And again, folks, we'll be doing a webcast right after this radio show. Go to InsideAnalysis.com to find a link to that webcast for our DevOps, Data Ops and DevOps show. But one of the things I love about data, and when you monitor data, even something as simple as web traffic, is you will find things that you would have otherwise missed. It just depends on how often it happens, how often you are focused on this data or that data. But if you're vigilant, if you're tracking information in your business, you're going to get surprised. Once a week, is it once a month? How often is it exactly? That depends. But if you're watching the data, you're going to see those changes, and I think that's really important, right?
Yeah, and I think what we want is it's also watching the data, but it's also interpreting it, right? In that way to, do you have enough time as a business leader to understand, is this anomaly or is this change significant to my business? And so that goes to the dialogue that you have with your team, who's actually doing the work for you. And if you can't have that dialogue and you can't trust that team to do the right work, and they're running around being heroes, or they're living in an environment of fear where if they're so afraid to make a mistake that they're just going to keep saying, no, that signal isn't, it's just noise. That signal is noise. And so you need to have a good culture in your organization that supports trust, that supports innovation, that doesn't kill people in the process with overwork, and also allows them to not live in sort of fear of making a mistake, and allows, like Gil said a little while ago, that if you do make mistakes, can you see that not as a career ender, but just as part of the normal process, and that you can fall forward and improve upon them. And one thing that I think is a good idea in any organization is to try to love your errors and try to improve on your errors. And that really goes back to that, Deming and Japanese manufacturing and quality circles to improve, because errors are part of life. And instead of shame and blame, what you need is to look at them and improve. And that's part of what the culture that needs to happen in any organization that's trying to make this transformation to become data-driven.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think it's a really good point to just remind ourselves of. That's one of my favorite cliches. Most grown-ups don't need to be taught so much as reminded that errors are part of life, and you need to learn from errors. And to your point, not have someone get so down on you for making a mistake. Now, you still need to know, okay, that was a mistake. And this is just a cultural thing. Again, you want people to be mature enough and bold enough and creative enough to be themselves and not be intimidated, because if you have that environment, that's not good at all. Well, folks, we burned through an hour here. Great time. We'll talk to you next week. You've been listening to Inside Analysis. Bye-bye.
I mean.